Welcome to today's last session. We have two papers in this session, and the first one to go is Daniel Alexander Milne from Bielefeld University, who will be presenting a paper called Developing Fictionally Immoral Attitudes, Spaces of Moral and Narrative Possibilities in Computer Games. Welcome, David.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I'm Daniel Milne. I'm from Bielefeld, and I must admit right from the start that I once killed a little girl. I killed her because I had developed an attitude of disgust towards humanity in general. And I failed to see how there could be empathy or moral responsibility or altruism in anyone. But I might also add that I had developed this attitude and as a result killed the little girl only in my imagination, which was proffered by the computer game BioShock. How many people know BioShock? Okay, very good. Right. BioShock, in my opinion, forcefully teaches the player how it feels like to develop such an attitude, to act in accordance with it, and most importantly, to feel responsible for having developed such an attitude. And secondly, I think that BioShock is for that very reason artistically valuable. Now, I want to use BioShock as evidence for this claim which I'm going to defend in this presentation. Namely, if artworks are artistically valuable insofar as they get us to adopt what's fictionally an immoral attitude, then this holds for computer games that are like BioShock in the relevant sense all the more, insofar as they get us to freely develop what's fictionally an immoral attitude. Okay, I will defend this proposition in two steps. First, I will need to specify what this relevant sense in which computer games can be like BioShock is. And secondly, I will then argue for this claim, namely that these computer games are particularly artistically valuable insofar as one is allowed to freely develop an immoral attitude within them. Okay, so let's begin with step one. Here you can see a screenshot of BioShock. BioShock asks the player to deal with the in-game little girls, which are called little sisters. One can either rescue them or harvest them. That results in getting more or less of the required resource for the game. Now, the game only shows one this screen, and then the player has to press a button, either to kill the little girl or to save the little girl. But in this first part of the presentation, I would like to emphasize that that's not all that's going on, because video games like BioShock have a characteristic that shows that much more is going on than the mere pressing of one of two buttons. In order to reach this class of computer games that interest me, I would like to start with a definition. And I've chosen the definition by the philosopher Dominic Lopez, who defines a computer game like this. He says, a game is a computer game if and only if it's interactive, it's run on a computer, and it's interactive because it's run on a computer. Now, the essential component of this definition is, of course, the interactivity. And Lopez's concept of interactivity needs to be explained a little. According to Lopez, when I play a computer game, I appreciate the display I generate by my playthrough. And according to him, every artwork has some kind of display, which is the structured entity that results from the artist's creativity and that we tune into when we appreciate the work. So in the case of computer games, mostly these displays consist, at least in part, of moving images on a screen, as well as some acoustic elements or haptic elements. Whereas in the case of a novel, for example, it's the sequence of words that tell a story. Now, according to Lopez, computer games are interactive in the sense that they prescribe their players to have a direct impact on the generated displays. So I, as a player, can do something with the game and thereby generate the display, which I cannot do while appreciating a non-interactive artwork. I can't do much with the novel other than just read it and just appreciate the one display that's there. Now, the computer game itself is not, as one might think, first the sum of the player-generated displays, but it's the work that's appreciated while the player appreciates her generated display as one among many possible displays of that computer game. Okay, so the player always has the pool of options in mind, so to speak. And that's appreciated when a computer game is appreciated. Now, I've already said that a computer game's display mostly consists of moving images on a screen, as well as acoustic and haptic elements. And in particular, this display can represent situations with an imagined existence only, and such representations are what I would just call fictions. And I would like to introduce the concept of an interactive fiction machine. I would say that a computer game is an interactive fiction machine if and only if its displays are fictions. Okay, so now we can see where this leads us. Interactive fictions are similar to non-interactive artworks insofar as they too prescribe their players to imagine that something is the case. But in addition, interactive fiction machines also prescribe players to generate fictions themselves. So for example, while playing BioShock, I was able to generate a fiction that represents the little sisters as being killed, or I was able to generate a fiction that represents the little sisters as being saved. Now, a question that emerges is that really all that's going on in this particular case, and maybe even for computer games in general? Because, as is quite clear, what the player does is essential for the generated fiction, and there is, of course, a tight player-display connection. An even tighter player-display connection than what I've just said seems to suggest. The player is not merely in the position to press some buttons and thereby generate a fiction, but something more is going on. Now, I would like to employ Walton's theory of fiction in order to explain what I think is going on. And we can use Walton's distinctions, Kendall Walton's distinctions between display worlds and make-believe worlds. I have renamed these worlds a little bit because it's easier to follow in the case of computer games. Now, a display world would be the fictional world of an interactive fiction machine's display. There are as many display worlds as there are players and as there are playthroughs by individual players. So the proposition that every sister was harvested is true in my display world. The make-believe world is what one could call an extended fiction, and it's the fictional world of the game of make-believe that one plays with an interactive fiction machine. So, for example, that I felt so-and-so while initiating the killing of the little sister is true in my make-believe world, but it is not true in the display world. So the crucial difference here is that normally we can say that a make-believe world might supplement a fiction because there is something going on in the reader, for example, in addition to the events depicted in the novel. But in computer games, the make-believe world also influences the fiction. Now, how does the make-believe world influence the fiction? Well, I would say that this is part of the make-believe world that we have imaginings from the inside. So, for example, we can imagine to experience what we make the player-controlled character experience in a fiction ourselves. So in the case of BioShock, I can imagine to wander the deserted halls of Rapture, which is where the game takes place. I can imagine doing this myself, and thereby I imagine from the inside. This can influence the generated fiction substantially, and in particular, it can influence the generated fiction if what we have are what could be called fiction-directed emotions. So, for example, while playing BioShock, one encounters these creatures, which are big daddies, and they protect the little sisters. Now, this is not an ideal situation, because it's not a proper weapon to fight the big daddies. They have to be fought in order to progress in the game. Now, one could say that I fear the big daddy. But with Walton, I would also want to say that it is not the case that I fear the big daddy, because for a genuine emotion of fear, a necessary condition is not fulfilled, namely that I don't believe myself actually to be in danger. So what happens is the following. It is true in my display world that the big daddies threaten the player-controlled character. No doubt about that. And it is true in my make-believe world that I myself am threatened by a big daddy because I imagined this. This in turn, according to Walton, results in fear-like sensations or quasi-fear. I mean, I can sweat, I can shiver, all that. It might feel just like fear, but it isn't genuine fear. But these fear-like sensations, they in turn make it true within my make-believe world that I experience a genuine emotion of fear. So these fear-like sensations, they generate fictional truths about themselves, so to speak. Now, as a final piece of conceptual build-up, before I argue for the claim I've introduced at the beginning, I want to say that such experiences enrich fictions with a sense of meaning and significance that's essential for genuine narratives. And I would like to call a computer game an interactive narrative machine if its displays are narratives in this experience transmitting sense, which comes from Monika Fludernik, a narratologist, to say that narratives involve the transmission of how someone felt in a certain situation. So what we have are interactive narrative machines. And if we come back to the screenshot I've shown you at the beginning, it is not all that's going on that we press one of two buttons and thereby generate a fiction. But instead it's a decision that's based on experiences or quasi-emotions, which are real emotions, but only within the fiction. These quasi-emotions, however, they're not deliberately imagined. They occur automatically. As a player, I can't do anything about them. Hence, they are real experiences. So I can say one is responsible for them, one can learn something from them, and fictions which prescribe these can satisfy one's desire for diverse experiences. Now, this leads me to part 2, developing fictionally immoral attitudes. According to the philosopher Matthew Kieran, an artwork can be artistically valuable insofar as it prescribes such a psychologically intelligible and self-illuminating imaginative experience, what I've talked about, the experiences I actually have, and they can be psychologically intelligible and self-illuminating, and for that reason, an artwork can be artistically valuable. In addition, Kieran claims that if this experience leads to the adoption of what's fictionally an immoral attitude, an artwork's artistic value can be enhanced. So how does Kieran argue for this position? This is the first part of his argument. His first premise is, imaginative experiences are valuable insofar as they enhance our understanding of something in otherwise unavailable ways. Secondly, artworks are artistically valuable insofar as they prescribe valuable imaginative experiences. Hence, we can say that artworks are artistically valuable insofar as they prescribe imaginative experiences that enhance our understanding of something in otherwise unavailable ways. That's the cognitive part of his claim, the epistemic part, that we can learn something from works of art. Secondly, he adds the premise 4. Premise 3 is what we've just arrived in the previous slide. Premise 4 says, imaginative experiences that get us to take up fictionally immoral attitudes can enhance our understanding of something in otherwise unavailable ways. Hence, his claim emerges, artworks can be artistically valuable insofar as they prescribe imaginative experiences that get us to take up fictionally immoral attitudes. Now, the crucial premise here is premise 4. So how does Kieran argue for premise 4, that we can learn something by adopting fictionally immoral attitudes? Well, he says that we need such immoral attitudes in order to fully understand morally good attitudes, because experiencing immoral attitudes forms a relevantly contrasting kind to actually having morally good attitudes. So if I actually experience an attitude immorally myself, that leads to an epistemic gain, which is therefore epistemically meritorious. Additionally, he says that imaginatively taking up an immoral attitude is an epistemically valuable substitute for actually taking up such an attitude, as long as this attitude is presented so that one is psychologically able and willing to entertain it. So by imaginatively experiencing an immoral attitude from within, in Walton's terms, we can have actual experiences which are fictionally emotions. So my emotion of disgust, or my quasi-emotion of disgust towards the little sister, was an immoral emotion in that instance. So this emotion actually made it fictional that I myself experienced an attitude immorally. That wasn't the right kind of attitude I had adopted. Oops. Now, if we buy this argument so far, we can add another premise, premise 4+. If all of that is right, if imaginative experiences that get us to take up fictionally immoral attitudes can enhance our understanding of something in otherwise unavailable ways, then this is the case all the more if we develop fictionally immoral attitudes ourselves. And this leads to another conclusion, C+. A work can therefore be artistically more valuable even if we develop a fictionally immoral attitude instead of just adopting a fictionally immoral attitude. Now, I claim that this is exactly what happens in the case of certain interactive narrative machines. They not only prescribe the player to adopt what's fictionally an immoral attitude, but to develop it oneself. And this is an epistemic merit. So we have the situation here. In non-interactive artworks, one can learn what it feels like to be in a state of mind that results in immoral actions. This is true also for certain interactive narrative machines. But additionally, the player can learn what it feels like to develop such a state of mind, to act in accordance with such a state of mind, and to be responsible for being in and acting in accordance with such a state of mind. And this, I would claim, is knowledge that isn't otherwise to be had, neither actually, because one doesn't want to engage in such immoral attitudes, nor fictionally by engaging with non-interactive works of art. So, given C, Kieran's conclusion, insofar as a work succeeds in getting one to imaginatively adopt an immoral attitude, it is artistically valuable. Given C+, insofar as an interactive narrative machine succeeds in getting one to imaginatively develop an immoral attitude, thereby renders it psychologically more intelligible and provides richer epistemic rewards than any non-interactive work could, the interactive narrative machine is artistically more valuable than any non-interactive work could be. So concluding, I would like to say that although many modern computer games have what is being called a morality system, it's not really a morality system in my sense, because many computer games merely ask the player to be good or evil for no particular reason, other than maybe enjoying it, or one doesn't have fiction internal reasons or prescribed emotions that lead to the development of such attitudes. And for artistic evaluation, it matters to what extent the prescribed imaginative experience is psychologically intelligible and epistemically rewarding. Now, if we experience what are non-deliberately occurring emotions in imagination, the condition of psychological intelligibleness is fulfilled to a very high degree, and the epistemic rewards, as I have argued, are also present. So interactive narrative machines allow for the development of such immoral attitudes in imagination, hence they are particularly and distinctively well suited to provide imaginative acquaintances of how one would feel if one fully engaged in an immoral attitude, that is, if one is responsible for such an attitude and if one acts out of such an attitude. And this is an epistemic merit, and with Kieran I would say it is also an artistic merit that only computer games or interactive narrative machines can provide, at least so far. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Are there any questions? Wait for the stream.
No, just to your conclusion, I think that theatre, essentially, and films and things, playing people in films and things, where the people who are acting are, in a certain sense, they take upon themselves possibly morally condemnable states of mind or attitudes, is quite similar, no? Or would you say it's completely different?
You mean the actors in a theatre?
Actors in a
play?
theatre, yeah, for example, or people playing roles, role-playing games, things like this. Because as I understood it, you mean this is a kind of a learning experience, no? That it offers a learning experience. I think role-playing games, for example, the LARP that I was talking about in my talk, those kind of things you do take upon yourselves, kind of dubious roles, for example, or do things, you're allowed to do things you wouldn't do in everyday life. I remember, for example, when we were at Volda, at the Game Research and Development Conference there, we had a kind of a LARP. We played a LARP where you were supposed to go and hit people with swords and things and to steal their things and things like that, which is, it seems to be very similar to what you do in games.
I think so too, but in that case, were there these quasi-emotions developing beforehand, out of which such a killing incident, for example, took place? If the players are, in a sense, emotionally engaged, so that out of anger or out of fear or out of disgust they act in such ways, then I think the epistemic rewards are very similar. I'm not quite sure about the artistic rewards, because it's quite difficult to define such a game as an artwork or as a piece of art. But another nice example would be something like improvisational theater, or something as an artwork, where there are many options available for those participating in it, and if this includes immoral acts, then one can have a similar experience. But no, but yes, that's very, very true. That's very similar. Yes.
Thank you for presentation. My question is really related to the first one, because you answered about the actors, but about the spectator also, because this is really similar in the conclusion, but also during the all the argument to the Aristotelian theory of art and theater too, as a catharsis possibility, where you can provide an imaginative acquaintance of how one would feel engaged in immoral attitude, because Aristotle speaks about tragedy, and also it is an epistemically and artistically valuable object, the tragedy, according to Aristotle. So, which is the difference in that case? Because from the point of view of the spectator, not of the actor.
Well, for the spectator, the difference is precisely in the ability to act him or herself in the case of...
Isn't the same, the result, in the conclusion? Yeah, but as a spectator, I can find all the conclusions you have found for the player.
Okay.
Or not?
I wouldn't say to that great extent. We had the example also of the TV series Breaking Bad earlier. I feel a little bit more comfortable in comparing it to that. In that sense, if one watches the TV series, one adopts the attitude, and one can have very many of these epistemic rewards by engaging in an immoral attitude. But one isn't able to do anything with it. One can just wait for it to evolve further or to take a different turn, but one can't act in accordance with it, and that's different in interactive art. So to that extent, I would say it's a difference. And you were also mentioning the actors. Are you also questioning whether that's relevantly similar? Pardon? Okay, yes,
Okay.
sure.
Daniel, maybe I could just press a little further on the example of first tragedy and then maybe the novel. So in the case of tragedy, catharsis refers, to purging of certain emotions, and I think pity is probably an inadequate translation. I think it's a kind of deeply felt empathy. I doubt whether Aristotle particularly admired members of the audience who were particularly susceptible of very, very deep forms of empathy, which might, for example, in an apocryphal story, seeing the Furies appear on stage, miscarrying, for example, that kind of thing. But catharsis is also, it has that epistemic component, it's also a kind of clarification, and I think that's the sense that Aristotle probably appreciated more. And then the example of the novel, I'm just sort of leading up to the question, the issue of interactivity that you were balking at. Kundera speaks of the novel in a fairly sort of hard way, as you do, as making available certain kinds of epistemic goods, not so much with regard to feelings, but phenomenologically in a more cognitive sense. And he makes the strong claim, I think it's an exaggeration, perhaps you're exaggerating too, that only the novel can do certain things, and you're making the claim that only an interactive INM can do certain things. I think probably a slightly weaker, more probabilistic rather than a logical claim would be in order. You could say this just for all intents and purposes. Something like this is available without making the logically hard, fast claim that only an IMM can achieve this. But I guess it might come down. Maybe I'll say a little. I'll rework what I was going to say to respond to the interactivity question.
Okay, maybe it is a little bit too much to say that interactive narrative machines are only available for these kinds of epistemic merits. We had the example of the improvisational theater, which can also provide one with this kind of epistemic merit. But what was my aim here primarily is to make interactive narrative machines, or computer games in general, a little bit more interesting for philosophers of art, and in particular for those who say that an artistic value can consist in the receiving of some kind of epistemic merit. And computer games are not very well received in the philosophy of art, and in particular not in this debate, which is the debate between artistic value and the ethics of artworks, whether there's some kind of intrinsic relationship. So my aim was just to bring these two things together, and interactive narrative machines are particularly well suited, but maybe not distinctively well suited. So yes, I agree.
There is time for one short question, if anyone has.
I've been doing a little bit of theater and improvisational theater, and it's this concept when you're engaging in that kind of learning experience, using your own actual emotions or quasi-emotions. There's this notion of getting dangerously close to the fire, especially when you're doing improvisational theater together. You're kind of opening up. Mm-hmm. You feel kind of vulnerable because you're opening up people to see, the parts of your soul that you maybe don't want, and so on. But how would that be in single player computer games in comparison?
You mean when or if the adoption of what's fictionally an immoral attitude actually becomes a real immoral attitude?
Yeah, it kind of plays on the border. Is this me? Is this a role? And all that. When you're doing improvisational theater, you quite quickly run into these kinds of can be uncomfortable. Because you're trying to use all the resources you can when you're acting.
Okay.
And I imagine also, there are these surveys that ask people how. Do you really choose to play bad when you play that and that game, role playing games? And a surprisingly high percentage, like 85%, they just play the best super Hollywood good guy they can. So I wonder, is there some sort of there's this idea that if you're engaging in that kind of learning process, it's too much. You're getting too close to it's uncomfortable.
Okay. Well, I don't know in how far this can really result in the player's feelings, how this can affect the player afterwards, whether this guilt or whatever can have an impact on after the game has been finished or anything. But I would like to separate the fictional world and the real world, as Walton does it, and say that the immoral attitude stays within the fictional world. It's only an immoral attitude within the fictional world. It can have effects on the player, but then this isn't the result of what was really an immoral attitude. But the effects can happen psychologically, just as these psychological experiences or quasi-emotions can happen automatically. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.